All right, welcome back. So what we're going to talk about this week is something I've just titled the early 1800s. So this will stretch from about 1800 during the time of Napoleon to the 1830s. And what we're going to talk about is how Europe actually reacted to Napoleon and what he ended up doing. And we'll see the roots of our own United Nation being formed during this period. This sometimes you get the 1800s called the century of isms. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to liberalism, conservatism, and then in the next lecture we are going to talk about imperialism. If you remember from 2 weeks ago, we talked about how Napoleon ended up taking over a large chunk of Europe, and after he was finally defeated, the Europeans had to decide how they were going to put Europe back together, and so what they ended up doing is meeting at something called the Congress of Vienna, and I've given you the date here, September 1814. And this was really run by a man named Talleyrand. And what I'll do in the next slide is talk a little bit about some of the details about the Congress of Vienna. But remember, it's set up primarily to deal with the problems that Napoleon had caused. Congress of Vienna. As I just mentioned, this is run by a man named Metternich, and he is, as we'll talk about, a conservative from Austria, meaning he wanted to retain the powers of the monarchy, and we'll get into that in just a bit. But at this Congress of Vienna, what they did is they invited all the countries of Europe to come together, except for the Ottomans, and originally they didn't want France to be involved, but you get a man named Talleyrand who ends up sort of getting his way and allowing France to be part of this big discussion, which actually makes sense. So as I put up here, you've got the major powers of Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And so these are the major military powers in the early 1800s. And as I mentioned, they didn't want France to be involved in this. This is probably a mistake on their part because, of course, France is the reason why they're meeting to deal with this. And to cut them out would cause some serious problems. So as I just mentioned, Talleyrand ended up getting into this conference. They also didn't invite the Ottoman Empire. That was probably another mistake. Now, of course, the Ottomans are Muslim, and so the European powers didn't really want to deal with these people, but we'll see this causes lots of problems later in the 1800s. Anyway, so the Congress of Vienna meets, and what they're going to try to do is reset some boundaries and so on. You can see I have quite a bit of text here, and it's not totally important to remember all of these things. But as I just mentioned, what's going to happen during this Congress of Vienna is they're going to reset the boundaries and really redraw Europe to hopefully prevent the rise of another country like France conquering everything. So what you have, of course, is France being told to return all the territory that it had conquered. And this is what they had to do based on the treaty. Now you've got the Russian state under Tsar Alexander. He wants to recreate the state of Poland. Now, this isn't out of the goodness of his heart. What he was really looking for is a buffer state between Europe and Russia. And we'll see that he actually gets his way here. You have a couple countries that are thrown together. So you've got the Dutch Republic and the Austrian Netherlands. They form a single country. You also have Norway and Sweden pushed into one country. Now, we'll talk about this either next week or in this next lecture on some of the problems that this ended up causing. You also have the independence of Switzerland being promised here. And if you know anything about Swiss history, you know that today they are still neutral. So Tsar Alexander gets his way and Poland is created. Now, as you can see from this slide, he becomes the King of Poland. And just remember, he wants the state of Poland recreated to form a buffer state. Prussians get some land out of this. And you also get the German Federation being created in 1819. Now, this did not create the modern state of Germany. That doesn't happen until the late 1800s, but this sort of forms them more united, you might want to say. So again, what's happening here is you're getting a balance of power being created. One of the things, too, that the Congress of Vienna really wanted was freedom of navigation on the seas, because a lot of those countries, their trade was reliant on rivers. And so they made this this agreement that all the rivers are free and open to all these different countries. But again, one of the main reasons for the Congress of Vienna is to create a balance of power and recreate these boundaries so that a country like France could not rise up again. Now, I just mentioned that France had to give away all of the territory that it had taken during the war. They also had to do some other things. One thing we'll be talking about later, and this is going to come up over and over again, is something called an indemnity. So really what this is a payment that they make to the people that they overrun during the war. So they had to pay a war indemnity. This is going to cause lots of problems, especially later on, and lead to world wars and so on. Another thing that France had to go through is that foreign troops would stay in Paris. So what they did, the reason for this is that France had to pay this indemnity, and the troops would stay there until France had paid off this debt or this payment. And as you can see from the slide, they ended up staying in Paris until 1818. So again, this war indemnity is going to be very common in European wars, and usually it leads to a source of revenge. Here I've given you a map of Europe, and what you might want to do is just stop the movie and take a look at some of these new boundaries. After the Congress of Vienna met and agreed on all of these things, you get a new group formed called the Concert of Europe. And remember that the Congress of Vienna was really set up to prevent countries from rising up like what France did during the wars with Napoleon. And this is exactly what the Concert of Europe was set up to do. And again, this is really the roots of our United Nations. So as I put up here, it's to prevent future military and civil disturbances. So we haven't really talked about this, but the conservatives, I had mentioned Metternich was a conservative. His idea is to preserve monarchy. So what you have is the conservatives on the side of Metternich trying to prevent these revolutions or any country rising up, and to suppress the ideas of liberalism, which we'll talk about in just a bit, but what we'll see is that liberalism is almost the opposite of conservatism. And I've also given you a list of some of the countries that agreed to meet on a regular basis. So you've got Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Great Britain. Now, they agreed on something which is kind of interesting called the principle of intervention, which meant that if a country starts rising up, the rest of them would gang up on that particular country. And they all essentially agreed to this. I also put up here, which isn't really important to remember, something called the Holy Alliance. And this was something that Russia wanted to put together and to make the common thread that tied all these countries together really religion. And all the other European countries just rejected this outright. They didn't want anything to do with that. But it's an interesting little sideline to the Concert of Europe. So again, it's put together to keep these countries from rising up and taking over most of Europe like France did. So I've just mentioned a couple terms, conservatism and liberalism. So what I've got here on this part of the movie is a better definition. And I'll give you some tags as well to look up these things. So I mentioned Metternich. He's a conservative. He was really pushing to preserve monarchy, or when they created these new countries, to put monarchs back in power. His idea was that strong monarchs would prevent revolutions. Conservatives in general rejected the Enlightenment. If you remember what the Enlightenment was about, it was about personal freedom, the liberty to say what you want, think what you want, and so on. So conservatives in general were afraid of that because they thought it would lead to problems. Religion played a fundamental role in conservatism because they really liked the idea of these monarchs who were appointed by God. Again, we're talking about control, so control of the population to prevent a revolution. And in general, they weren't very optimistic about human nature. So liberals are exactly the opposite of conservatives. So they love the Enlightenment, the idea that you've got personal freedom to move where you want to say what you want to, and so on. They really liked constitutional monarchies, or not so much democratic governments just yet, But certainly if you think about constitutional monarchy, where you've got a king on one side and a constitution on another, where they balance each other out. Their idea is that if you have that type of government, it prevents revolutions from happening. And of course, I just mentioned with the Enlightenment, you've got freedom of speech, press, religion, and so on. And in general, the liberals had an optimistic view of humans, meaning if you give them freedom, they will be good. Another ism from this particular century is nationalism. So this starts out when, especially when the Congress of Vienna was starting to put all these countries together, and sometimes you've got two countries or two groups of people thrown together like Norway and Sweden who are very different. So these are ethnic groups where they've got their own culture essentially, and they're starting to look for protection. Now in the first half of the 1800s, the nationalistic movement was associated with liberalism, so all these freedoms. In the second half of the 1800s, you get a flip where nationalism is associated with conservatism, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So you've got the Congress of Vienna and the Council of Europe all set up. They're, again, set up to prevent all of these revolutions, and it didn't quite work because you see a few revolutions happening in 1830. And so what I've given you here is just a little background about a revolution that happened in France again that had to deal with kings who wanted absolute monarchy and didn't quite work. So anyway, you've got a revolution in France once again. You also have a split with Belgium and Holland. And I've given you some of the examples here. Belgium was normally associated with England. They're Catholic and they spoke French. Now, if you look at Holland, they're different. They're mostly Protestant and they spoke their own language. So you've got a revolution in 1830 where these two split up. And as you can see from the slide, what happens is the Congress system was set up. And what it did was it split the two apart and it gave Belgium a constitutional monarchy. Now, what's really interesting is that one of the deals with this is that Belgium, to become its own country, had to agree to be neutral. And this is going to play a part when we talk about World War I because, and World War II. A lot of countries who were beginning to fight were sort of depending on Belgium to remain neutral, and then it didn't. But anyway, this was the deal for breaking up these two countries. An interesting side effect of these revolutions and problems that Europeans were having is that some of their holdings in especially Central and South America broke away during this particular period because they were arguing and fighting over all these other things. So I've given you here a list of some of the independence dates for countries in Central and South America. So for example, 1810, Argentina became free. And then of course you've got the rest of them going down to Brazil in 1825. It's after this that the United States issued something called the Monroe Doctrine. And what the Monroe Doctrine said is it would prevent any European country from having any military influence in the Western Hemisphere. And the US really stuck to this. Now, in the end, it didn't quite work because what happens is that Britain gets an economic hold in a lot of these countries. But we might take a look at this in a few weeks where we'll see that the United States was heavily defending the Monroe Doctrine from European takeover of these countries.